The red marker trembled in Dr. Elena Vasquez's hand as she traced the final trajectory line. Across the satellite image projected on the wall of Conference Room 7, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the 12 men seated around the polished mahogany table. Each wore the same expression of barely concealed impatience, their eyes already drifting toward watches, phones, and the stack of more pressing matters waiting on their desks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Based on the electromagnetic signature patterns detected by our deep space monitoring array, Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers, we have approximately 72 hours before the weapon achieves optimal deployment. Altitude. The silence that followed was not the thoughtful contemplation she had hoped for. It was the kind of silence that preceded dismissal, the institutional equivalent of a polite cough before being shown the door. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks, ever since the anomalous readings first appeared. On her monitoring station deep within the classified levels of the Pentagon's Intelligence Analysis Division. At 32, she possessed the kind of analytical mind that thrived on patterns others couldn't see, connections that existed in the spaces between data points. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her glasses reflected the glow of multiple computer screens that had become her constant companions during the sleepless nights leading up to this briefing. The conference room itself was a temple to military hierarchy, its walls lined with portraits of decorated generals, whose stern gazes seemed to judge anyone who dared to challenge conventional wisdom. The American flag stood at attention in the corner, its fabric crisp and unwavering, much like the men who now sat in judgment of her conclusions. Elena had requested this emergency briefing through proper channels, following every protocol, dotting every bureaucratic I, and crossing every procedural T. General Marcus Blackwood dominated the head of the table like a monument to military tradition. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. His silver hair perfectly styled, his uniform decorated with ribbons that told the story of 3 decades of successful command decisions. His steel-gray eyes had the quality of surgical instruments, precise and cutting, designed to dissect weakness and expose incompetence. Dr. Vasquez, he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. You're asking us to believe that a rogue state has somehow deployed an electromagnetic pulse weapon in orbit without our knowledge. A weapon that will, according to your calculations, be used to attack Washington, D.C. within the next 3 days. Elena straightened in her chair, acutely aware that she was the only woman in the room, the only civilian, and certainly the only person present who had spent the last 72 hours surviving on coffee and determination. General Blackwood. The satellite imagery clearly shows the deployment pattern. The electromagnetic emissions are consistent with a high-altitude EMP device. The orbital mechanics alone suggest what, Doctor? The interruption came from Colonel James Patterson, Blackwood's right-hand man, whose reputation for loyalty was matched only by his disdain for what he called academic speculation. Patterson leaned forward, his weathered face creased with the kind of skepticism that had become his trademark. That some third-world country managed to outwit our entire intelligence apparatus? That they've developed technology our best scientists say is impossible? The murmurs around the table were not encouraging. Elena could feel the momentum of the room shifting against her, the collective weight of institutional skepticism pressing down like a physical force. She had anticipated this resistance, had prepared for it, but experiencing it firsthand was like being caught in an avalanche of dismissal. Colonel Patterson, Elena replied, her voice gaining strength from the certainty of her analysis. The electromagnetic signature is unlike anything in our current database. The deployment method appears to utilize a combination of commercial satellite technology and weaponized components that would be nearly impossible to detect through conventional monitoring. The sophistication suggests state-level resources, but the execution shows creativity that our traditional intelligence models don't account for. General Blackwood's expression had not changed, but Elena noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed once against the table surface. These were the tells of a man who had built his career on making decisions based on established intelligence patterns, who trusted systems and procedures more than individual insights. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his tone taking on the paternal quality that Elena had learned to fear more than outright anger. "You've been with the analysis division for how long?" 2 years? 3? 2 years and 4 months, sir. "And in that time, how many threat assessments have you filed?" Elena felt the trap being constructed around her, each question a brick in a wall designed to isolate her from credibility. 47, General." 47, Blackwood repeated, allowing the number to hang in the air like evidence in a trial. "And of those 47 assessments, how many resulted in actionable intelligence that prevented actual threats?" The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that preceded execution. Elena knew the answer, had known it would be used against her, but honesty was her only weapon against the institutional machinery that was systematically dismantling her credibility. 3, sir. 3 resulted in actionable intelligence. 3 out of 47. Blackwood's voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "That's a success rate of approximately 6%. Would you say that qualifies you as someone whose judgment we should trust when it comes to matters of national security?" Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar burn of academic humiliation that she had experienced throughout her career whenever her unconventional thinking collided with established authority. But this was different. This wasn't about academic pride or career advancement. This was about the lives of millions, of people who had no idea that their government was about to dismiss the one warning that could save them. "General Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional undertow threatening to pull her under, "the success rate is irrelevant when we're talking about a potential catastrophic event. The cost of being wrong in this instance far exceeds the risk of taking precautionary measures." "Precautionary measures?" Colonel Patterson's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Doctor, do you have any idea what you're suggesting? Evacuation protocols for Washington, D.C. Shutting down the electrical grid? Scrambling fighter jets to hunt for a weapon that our satellite network says doesn't exist?" The other men around the table began to shift in their seats, the collective body language of a group that had already reached its conclusion and was merely waiting for the formalities to conclude. Elena recognized the signs, had seen them in academic conferences, where her research was dismissed as too speculative, too far outside the accepted parameters of conventional thinking. "The electromagnetic readings don't lie," Elena said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. "The orbital mechanics are mathematically precise. The timing corresponds exactly with the intelligence reports about increased chatter from hostile organizations. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion." "Every piece of evidence," General Blackwood repeated, his voice taking on the quality of a teacher correcting a particularly stubborn student, "that you've interpreted through the lens of your own assumptions. Dr. Vasquez, what you're describing as evidence, I see as a pattern of coincidences that you've arranged to support a predetermined conclusion." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Elena felt something fracture inside her chest, the careful professional facade that she had maintained throughout her career, beginning to crack under the pressure of being systematically discredited by men who had never spent a single hour analyzing the data she had been living with for weeks. "General," she said, her voice quieter now but carrying a new edge of desperation, "I understand that my analysis challenges conventional thinking. I understand that the implications are enormous. But I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the data yourself. To consider the possibility that our traditional intelligence gathering methods might have missed something. Missed something? The question came from Admiral Robert Chun, the Naval Intelligence representative who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades in the intelligence community, who had seen enough genuine threats to recognize the difference between real danger and academic paranoia. Admiral Chun, Elena said, turning toward him with something approaching hope. The naval intelligence reports from the Pacific Fleet show increased submarine activity in the deployment window. The timing isn't coincidental. It's coordinated. Chun's expression didn't change, but Elena caught the slight nod that suggested he had at least considered her argument. It was the first sign of potential support she had received in the 45 minutes since the briefing began. Dr. Vasquez, Chun said carefully, the submarine activity you're referencing is routine patrol patterns. We've seen nothing that suggests coordination with any orbital deployment. The last flicker of hope died in Elena's chest. Even the one person who had seemed willing to consider her analysis had ultimately dismissed it as misinterpretation of routine military activity. She looked around the table, seeing the same expression on every face, the institutional certainty that comes from years of being right about conventional threats. Gentlemen, General Blackwood said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Dr. Vasquez has presented her analysis with admirable thoroughness. However, I think we can all agree that the conclusions she's drawn are not supported by credible intelligence. The electromagnetic anomalies she's identified are most likely solar weather effects or satellite interference. Elena felt the room closing in around her, the collective weight of institutional dismissal pressing down like a physical force. She had one more card to play, one final piece of evidence that she had been saving for this moment. General Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying a new urgency. 3 days ago, our monitoring station detected a brief communication burst from the anomalous object. We were able to decrypt part of the message. The room fell silent again. But this time Elena sensed a different quality to the quiet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mention of intercepted communications had penetrated the wall of skepticism, if only slightly. The partial decrypt contained references to Project Blackout and coordinates that correspond exactly to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The transmission was in a cipher that matches patterns we've seen from the same hostile organization that's been the subject of increased intelligence chatter. General Blackwood's expression had not changed, but Elena noticed the slight pause. Before he responded, the momentary hesitation that suggested her final revelation had at least given him pause. Dr. Vasquez, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made his decision and would not be swayed by additional evidence. Intercepted communications are notoriously unreliable. Code names like Project Blackout could refer to anything from a cyber attack to a power grid simulation. You're connecting dots that don't necessarily form a coherent picture. But General, Dr. Blackwood's voice cut through her protest like a blade. I've heard enough. Your analysis is thorough, but your conclusions are based on speculation and coincidence rather than actionable intelligence. The Defense Department cannot mobilize resources based on what amounts to educated guesswork. Elena felt the last of her professional composure slip away, replaced by the raw desperation of someone who knew she was witnessing a catastrophic failure of the very systems designed to protect the nation. General Blackwood, I'm begging you to reconsider. The cost of being wrong. The cost of being wrong, Blackwood interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time during the briefing, is exactly what I'm trying to avoid. Dr. Vasquez, you're asking me to recommend actions that would cause panic, disrupt the government, and potentially compromise national security, based on analysis that our most experienced intelligence officers find unconvincing. The general stood, his movement, signaling the end of the briefing with the finality of a closing door. The other men around the table began to gather their papers, their body language broadcasting relief that they could finally return to more pressing matters. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice returning to the paternal tone that Elena had. "Learn to despise. I want you to return to your station and continue monitoring the situation. If any credible evidence emerges that supports your conclusions, you're to report it immediately through proper channels. But I want you to understand that crying wolf repeatedly will not enhance your credibility within this organization." Elena remained seated as the room emptied around her, the weight of institutional dismissal settling over her like a burial shroud. She had presented her analysis with every tool at her disposal, had followed every protocol, had spoken truth to power, in the way that democratic institutions were supposed to encourage. And she had been systematically discredited by men who valued institutional stability over the possibility that their worldview might be incomplete. The last person to leave was Colonel Patterson, who paused at the door and looked back at her with something approaching sympathy. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I know this is difficult, but you have to understand that we deal with dozens of potential threats every day. We can't respond to every analysis that suggests catastrophic consequences. The system works because we trust proven methods and established intelligence sources." Elena looked up at him, seeing not cruelty, but genuine belief in the system that had just failed so completely. "Colonel Patterson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens if I'm right?" Patterson's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the momentary flicker of doubt that suggested her question had found its mark. "Dr. Vasquez," he said finally, "if you're right, then we'll deal with the consequences. But the probability of that is so low that we can't justify the resources required to address it." After he left, Elena sat alone in the empty conference room, surrounded by the portraits of generals who had faced their own moments of decision, who had weighed evidence and risk and made choices that shaped history. She wondered how many of them had dismissed warnings that later proved accurate, how many had chosen institutional stability over the possibility of being wrong. The electromagnetic readings were still there, still showing the same patterns that had convinced her of the impending threat. The orbital mechanics remained mathematically precise. The intercepted communications still contained references to Project Blackout and coordinates that matched Washington, D.C. exactly. Nothing had changed except her credibility within the very institution that was supposed to protect the nation from exactly this kind of threat. Elena gathered her papers and laptop, her movements mechanical and precise despite the emotional devastation she felt. She had 67 hours remaining before her calculations suggested the weapon would be deployed. 67 hours to find some way to convince the people in power that their dismissal of her analysis might be the most costly mistake in the history of American intelligence. As she walked through the corridors of the Pentagon, Elena noticed the way people looked at her, the slight aversion in their eyes that suggested word of her failed briefing was already spreading through the intelligence community. She was being transformed from Dr. Elena Vasquez, respected analyst, into that woman who cried wolf about an EMP attack, whose paranoid theories had wasted the time of important people. The elevator ride to her office felt like a descent into professional purgatory. She had burned her credibility in pursuit of what she believed was truth, and the institutional machinery had responded by systematically destroying her ability to be taken seriously in the future. It was a perfect demonstration of how democratic institutions could fail not through malice, but through the very structures designed to prevent overreaction to unsubstantiated threats. Elena's office was a small windowless space deep in the analytical division, surrounded by the humming servers and monitoring equipment that formed the nervous system of American intelligence gathering. Her desk was covered with printouts, satellite images, and mathematical calculations that told the story of her growing certainty about the impending attack. To anyone else, it would look like the obsessive workspace of someone who had lost perspective. To Elena, it was the accumulated evidence of institutional blindness. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dim light of the office. The electromagnetic readings were still there, still showing the same patterns that had convinced her of the threat. The orbital mechanics remained mathematically precise. The intercepted communications still contained references to Project Blackout and coordinates that matched Washington, D.C. exactly. Elena began typing her follow-up report, documenting the briefing and the institutional response to her analysis. She wrote with the precision of someone who knew that history would judge not just her conclusions, but the process by which those conclusions had been evaluated and dismissed. She was creating a record of institutional failure, a document that would either vindicate her analysis or serve as evidence of her own analytical shortcomings. The hours passed in a blur of documentation and continued monitoring. Elena's equipment continued to track the anomalous object, recording its orbital adjustments and electromagnetic emissions with the indifferent precision of scientific instruments. The data continued to support her conclusions, but data without institutional credibility was merely information shouting into the void. At 11:37 p.m., Elena's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed only a number she didn't recognize, but the encryption protocols indicated it was coming from within the intelligence community. Dr. Vasquez. A voice said, "This is Agent Sarah Chun from the National Security Agency. I've been reviewing your analysis of the electromagnetic anomaly. I think we need to talk." Elena felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. "Agent Chun, are you saying you believe my conclusions?" "I'm saying that some of your analysis aligns with intelligence we've been developing through other channels. Intelligence that suggests your warnings might not be as paranoid as certain people believe." The call lasted 17 minutes, during which Elena learned that the NSA had been monitoring increased chatter from hostile organizations, that certain communication patterns had been flagged as potentially related to orbital weapons deployment, and that her analysis had been forwarded to analysts who specialized in unconventional threat assessment. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Chun said before ending the call, "Keep monitoring the situation. Document everything. And be prepared to brief people who might be more receptive to your conclusions than the ones you spoke with today." Elena hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the dark computer screen. She had 59 hours remaining before her calculation suggested the weapon would be deployed. 59 hours to convince someone in power that the institutional dismissal of her analysis might be the most costly mistake in the history of American intelligence. The electromagnetic readings continued to stream across her monitors, each data point a confirmation of her growing certainty about the impending threat. Elena had been right about the analysis, right about the orbital mechanics, right about the intercepted communications. The question was whether being right would be enough to overcome the institutional machinery that had already dismissed her as paranoid. She looked at the photos on her desk, images of her parents who had fled political persecution in their home country and found refuge in America, who had raised her to believe that democratic institutions were humanity's best hope for preventing catastrophic failures of governance. They had taught her that speaking truth to power was both a privilege and a responsibility, that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance against the forces that would silence inconvenient truths. Elena returned to her analysis, diving deeper into the electromagnetic patterns, searching for additional evidence that might penetrate the wall of institutional skepticism. She had been dismissed once, but she was far from finished. The next 59 hours would determine whether her warnings would be heeded or whether she would join the ranks of analysts whose correct predictions had been ignored until it was too late. The data continued to flow across her screens, each reading a reminder that truth existed independent of institutional acceptance, that reality would unfold according to its own logic, regardless of whether the people in power chose to acknowledge. Elena had done her job by presenting the analysis. Now she had to find a way to make someone listen before it was too late to prevent the catastrophe she saw approaching with mathematical certainty. The clock on her desk read 11:54 p.m. In 58 hours and 6 minutes, her calculations suggested that Washington, D.C. would be hit by an electromagnetic pulse that would cripple the government and potentially kill millions of people. Elena had been dismissed as paranoid, but paranoia was just another word for vigilance when the threat was real. She opened a new document and began typing her next report, the one that would either save the nation or mark her as the analyst who had correctly predicted a catastrophe that no one had been willing to prevent. The electromagnetic readings continued to stream across her monitors, each data point a confirmation that time was running out for institutional skepticism to transform into institutional action. The secure elevator descended through levels that didn't appear on any public blueprint of the Pentagon, carrying Elena deeper into the classified heart of American intelligence operations. Agent Sarah Chun stood beside her, a woman in her early 40s whose calm demeanor masked the intensity that Elena had glimpsed during their phone conversation the previous night. Chun's credentials had checked out through every security protocol Elena knew, and her knowledge of the electromagnetic anomaly suggested access to intelligence streams that Elena hadn't been cleared to see. "Dr. Vasquez," Chun said as the elevator settled at sublevel 7, "what I'm about to show you doesn't officially exist. The analysis you presented yesterday triggered automated alerts and systems that most people in that conference room don't know about. Your General Blackwood operates in the traditional intelligence sphere. We operate in the spaces between the lines." The corridor they entered was sterile and utilitarian, lined with doors that bore only numerical designations. Elena could hear the faint hum of electronic equipment behind the walls, the sound of computers processing information that would never appear in congressional briefings or intelligence summaries. This was the deep architecture of national security, the hidden nervous system that monitored threats too unconventional for traditional analysis. Chun led her to a door marked only with SC7 and pressed her palm against a biometric scanner. The lock disengaged with a soft click, revealing a room that looked like the command center of a science fiction film. Multiple screens displayed satellite feeds, electromagnetic spectrum analyzes, and communication intercepts in real time. 3 analysts worked at individual stations, their faces illuminated by the glow of data streams that never stopped flowing. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," Chun announced to the room, the analyst who identified the orbital anomaly. A young man with thick glasses looked up from his workstation, his expression mixing respect with curiosity. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm Marcus Webb. I've been following your electromagnetic analysis. The orbital mechanics calculations are extraordinary. How did you identify the deployment pattern?" Elena felt a surge of validation that was almost overwhelming after the dismissal she had experienced in the conference room. Here were people who understood the technical aspects of her work, who could appreciate the complexity of the analysis she had performed. "The electromagnetic signature was unlike anything in our standard databases," Elena explained, moving toward Webb's workstation where her own data was displayed alongside additional information she hadn't seen before. "But when I correlated it with orbital mechanics and timing patterns, the deployment strategy became clear." "Show her the communication intercepts," Chun said to another analyst, a woman with short red hair who was monitoring multiple audio feeds simultaneously. "Dr. Vasquez," the woman said, introducing herself as Jennifer Park, "we've been tracking communication patterns from 3 separate hostile organizations over the past 6 weeks. Individually, the chatter seemed routine. But when we applied your timeline analysis, patterns emerged that support your conclusions. Elena studied the communication data, seeing her own analysis reflected and amplified by intelligence-gathering capabilities she hadn't known existed. The intercept showed coordination between groups that traditionally operated independently, timing that correlated exactly with the orbital deployment she had identified, and code words that matched the partial decrypt she had presented to General Blackwood. Project Blackout isn't just a code name, Park continued, highlighting specific communication threads. It's a coordinated attack plan that involves simultaneous strikes on infrastructure, government facilities, and communication networks. The EMP deployment is designed to create chaos that will mask and amplify conventional attacks. The scope of the threat was larger than Elena had imagined. Her analysis had focused on the electromagnetic pulse weapon itself, but the NSA team had identified it as one component of a multi-layered attack designed to cripple the government's ability to respond to subsequent strikes. Dr. Vasquez, Chun said, her voice carrying new urgency, your timeline gives us 46 hours before deployment. Our additional intelligence suggests the attack will be coordinated with conventional strikes on critical infrastructure. We're looking at a scenario that could collapse government operations entirely. Elena felt the weight of validation and terror in equal measure. She had been right about the EMP weapon, but the full scope of the threat was beyond anything she had calculated. The dismissal by General Blackwood and his team wasn't just institutional blindness. It was a catastrophic failure to recognize the kind of unconventional attack that traditional intelligence methods were designed to miss. What's our next step? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. We brief this up the chain, Chun replied, but not through traditional channels. There are people in the intelligence community who specialize in threats that fall outside conventional parameters. People who have the authority to take action when traditional analysis fails. The briefing took place in a conference room that Elena hadn't known existed, located in a section of the Pentagon that required clearances she had only recently been granted. The attendees were a mixture of intelligence officials, military officers, and civilian analysts who operated in the margins of national security policy. Unlike the previous day's meeting, this room carried an atmosphere of focused attention rather than institutional skepticism. Deputy Director of National Intelligence Patricia Morrison presided over the meeting, a woman whose reputation for unconventional thinking had made her both respected and controversial within the intelligence community. At 55, she possessed the kind of analytical mind that had identified emerging threats before they materialized into crises, and her willingness to consider possibilities outside traditional parameters had prevented several catastrophic intelligence failures. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than hierarchy. Agent Chun has briefed me on your analysis and the supporting intelligence her team has developed. Walk me through your conclusions. Elena presented her analysis again, but this time to an audience that understood the technical details and appreciated the complexity of the threat assessment. The electromagnetic data was examined by specialists who could verify her calculations. The orbital mechanics were reviewed by analysts who worked with satellite deployment on a daily basis. The communication intercepts were correlated with ongoing intelligence operations that provided additional context. The coordination timing is the most compelling evidence, Morrison said after Elena had finished her presentation. Dr. Vasquez, your original analysis focused on the EMP weapon itself. Agent Chun's team has identified it as part of a larger attack strategy. Combined, the intelligence picture suggests a threat that our traditional warning systems weren't designed to detect. Colonel William Torres, a man Elena didn't recognize, but whose questions demonstrated deep technical knowledge, leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Vasquez, The orbital deployment method you've identified would require technological capabilities that most hostile organizations don't possess. How confident are you in the analysis? Colonel Torres, Elena replied, her confidence strengthened by the technical validation she had received. The electromagnetic signature is definitive. The orbital mechanics are mathematically precise. The communication intercepts provide additional confirmation. Individually, each piece of evidence might be questioned. Together, they form a pattern that's statistically impossible to dismiss. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison said, her voice taking on the weight of decision. If your analysis is correct, we have less than 46 hours to prevent an attack that could collapse government operations. If your analysis is wrong, we'll be mobilizing resources and potentially causing panic based on what amounts to sophisticated speculation. Elena understood the choice Morrison was facing. Unlike General Blackwood, who had dismissed her analysis based on institutional skepticism, Morrison was weighing the actual costs and benefits of action versus inaction. Deputy Director Morrison, Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The cost of being wrong in either direction is enormous. But the cost of failing to prevent this attack exceeds the cost of taking precautionary measures. Agent Chun, Morrison said, turning to the NSA representative, what additional assets can your team deploy to verify Dr. Vasquez's timeline? We have deep space monitoring capabilities that can provide additional electromagnetic analysis, Chun replied. We can also increase surveillance of the communication networks that have shown coordinated activity. If Dr. Vasquez's timeline is accurate, we should see increased chatter and preparation activity within the next 12 hours. Morrison stood, her movement signaling a shift from analysis to action. Dr. Vasquez, I want you to continue monitoring the electromagnetic anomaly. Document every change, every variation, every piece of data that could help us understand the deployment timeline. Agent Chun, increase surveillance on all communication networks associated with this threat. I want real-time intelligence on any changes in coordination patterns. Elena felt a surge of professional validation that was tempered by the growing realization that being right about the threat meant millions of lives were at risk. She had moved from institutional dismissal to institutional acceptance, but acceptance brought with it the weight of responsibility for what happened next. Deputy Director Morrison, Elena said, what about General Blackwood and the traditional intelligence assessment? They've already dismissed this analysis as paranoid speculation. Morrison's expression hardened slightly, the look of someone who had navigated institutional politics long enough to understand how bureaucratic blindness could create catastrophic vulnerabilities. Dr. Vasquez, Morrison said, General Blackwood operates within established parameters and proven methodologies. That approach works well for conventional threats. But unconventional threats require unconventional analysis, and sometimes that means bypassing traditional channels when institutional inertia threatens national security. The meeting concluded with Elena being assigned to a task force that operated outside normal Pentagon protocols. She would continue her electromagnetic analysis while working directly with NSA assets and specialized intelligence units that most Pentagon personnel didn't know existed. It was professional validation beyond anything she had imagined, but it came with the terrifying responsibility of being right about a threat that could reshape American society. Elena returned to her office to find a message from General Blackwood's staff requesting her immediate presence in his office. The tone of the request suggested that word of her involvement with unconventional intelligence operations had reached the traditional command structure, and institutional politics were about to collide with operational necessity. General Blackwood's office was a shrine to military tradition, its walls lined with photographs of him with various dignitaries and memorials to successful operations he had commanded. The man himself sat behind a massive desk that seemed designed to emphasize the distance between command authority and subordinate personnel. His expression when Elena entered was carefully controlled, but she could sense the anger that burned beneath his professional demeanor. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that Elena had learned to fear more than shouting. "I understand you've been sharing your electromagnetic analysis with other agencies. Agencies that operate outside normal intelligence protocols." Elena straightened in her chair, recognizing that she was being called to account for going around the institutional hierarchy that had dismissed her warnings. "General Blackwood, I followed proper channels when I briefed you yesterday. When those channels failed to produce action on a critical threat, I sought alternative avenues for ensuring national security." "Alternative avenues," Blackwood repeated, his voice taking on the dangerous quiet that preceded institutional retaliation. "Dr. Vasquez, you circumvented the chain of command. You shared classified analysis with agencies that have no jurisdiction over Pentagon intelligence operations. You've potentially compromised ongoing operations and created unauthorized intelligence sharing that violates established protocols." Elena felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure, but this time, it was tempered by the knowledge that her analysis had been validated by people who understood unconventional threats. She was no longer an isolated analyst facing the machinery of bureaucratic dismissal. "General Blackwood," Elena said, her voice gaining strength from the certainty of her position, "my analysis indicates that Washington, D.C. will be hit by an electromagnetic pulse weapon in less than 45 hours. The NSA has correlated my findings with intelligence that suggests a coordinated attack on government facilities. The threat is real, it's imminent, and traditional intelligence channels have failed to address it adequately." "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, standing and moving around his desk in a display of physical intimidation that Elena recognized as a standard technique for reasserting authority. "You're a civilian analyst with 2 years of experience who has presented 47 threat assessments with a 6% accuracy rate. Your judgment has been evaluated by experienced intelligence professionals and found to be unreliable." The attack on her credibility was exactly what Elena had expected, but it no longer carried the devastating weight it had possessed 24 hours earlier. She had been validated by analysts who understood her work, supported by intelligence professionals who specialized in unconventional threats, and tasked with responsibilities that demonstrated institutional confidence in her abilities. "General Blackwood," Elena replied, her voice steady and professional, "my analysis has been reviewed and validated by the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. The electromagnetic data has been verified by NSA specialists. The threat assessment has been incorporated into ongoing intelligence operations. My accuracy rate on conventional threats is irrelevant when dealing with unconventional attack methods." Blackwood's expression shifted, the careful control slipping slightly to reveal the anger that Elena's response had triggered. She was no longer the isolated analyst who could be dismissed through institutional pressure. She had become part of an alternative power structure that operated outside his authority. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice rising slightly, "you've created a chain of unauthorized intelligence sharing that undermines established protocols. You've compromised operational security by discussing classified analysis with agencies that have no need to know. You've exceeded your authority and potentially damaged national security by creating confusion within the intelligence community." Elena understood that Blackwood was not motivated by genuine security concerns, but by the institutional challenge her actions represented. She had gone around his authority, found validation from alternative sources, and demonstrated that his dismissal of her analysis had been incorrect. In the world of institutional politics, being wrong was less damaging than being bypassed. "General Blackwood," Elena said, standing to meet his physical intimidation with her own demonstration of confidence, "my analysis has been validated by multiple intelligence sources. The threat timeline has been confirmed through additional surveillance. The attack methodology has been verified through technical specialists. The only thing that's been damaged is the assumption that traditional intelligence channels can identify and respond to every threat. The confrontation was interrupted by Elena's secure phone, which rang with the priority tone that indicated urgent communication from the task force she had been assigned to. She glanced at Blackwood, who nodded curtly, giving permission for her to answer. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Chun's voice carried new urgency. "We've detected changes in the electromagnetic signature. The orbital adjustments are accelerating. Your timeline may have been optimistic." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "How optimistic?" "We're looking at deployment in 28 hours, not 45. The attack is happening faster than your original calculations suggested." Elena ended the call and looked at General Blackwood, whose expression had shifted from anger to something approaching concern. The validation of her analysis by other agencies was one thing, but the acceleration of the threat timeline transformed the situation from bureaucratic politics to operational crisis. "General," Elena said, her voice carrying new authority derived from the urgency of the situation, "the electromagnetic pulse weapon will be deployed in 28 hours. The coordinated attack on government facilities will follow immediately. We have less than a day to prepare defensive measures." Blackwood's institutional skepticism was warring with the growing evidence that Elena's analysis was not paranoid speculation but accurate threat assessment. His career had been built on traditional intelligence methods and established protocols, but those methods were failing to address a threat that operated outside conventional parameters. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice losing some of its earlier certainty, "assuming your analysis is correct, what defensive measures are you recommending?" Elena recognized the shift in his tone, the movement from dismissal to grudging acceptance that her warnings might be accurate. It was institutional validation, but it came too late to prevent the crisis that was approaching with accelerating speed. "General Blackwood," Elena said, "the EMP weapon will target Washington, D.C. as electrical grid. Government facilities need to be hardened against electromagnetic interference. Critical personnel need to be evacuated to secure locations. Communication systems need backup protocols that can function without standard electrical infrastructure." "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said, his voice taking on the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the scope of the crisis, "those recommendations would require resources and authorization that exceed my command authority. We're talking about mobilizing federal emergency response systems, coordinating with multiple agencies, and implementing defensive measures that could affect millions of civilians." Elena understood that Blackwood was facing the same choice that Deputy Director Morrison had confronted earlier, the decision to take action based on analysis that challenged conventional thinking. The difference was that Blackwood's institutional position made him resistant to unconventional threats, while Morrison's experience had taught her to recognize the cost of dismissing sophisticated analysis. "General Blackwood," Elena said, "the alternative is allowing an attack that could collapse government operations and potentially kill millions of people. The cost of defensive measures is insignificant compared to the cost of failing to prevent the attack." Blackwood moved to his window, looking out at the Pentagon courtyard where military personnel moved with the purposeful efficiency of an institution that prided itself on readiness. Elena could see him wrestling with the institutional implications of accepting her analysis, the acknowledgement that his initial dismissal had been a potentially catastrophic error in judgment. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said without turning from the window, "if I forward your recommendations up the chain of command, if I endorse defensive measures based on your analysis, I'm essentially admitting that my initial assessment was wrong. I'm acknowledging that traditional intelligence methods failed to identify a critical threat." Elena realized that the institutional barrier she was facing was not skepticism, about her analysis, but resistance to admitting institutional failure. Blackwood's career and reputation were built on the assumption that established intelligence methods could identify and assess any genuine threat. Accepting her analysis meant accepting that those methods had fundamental limitations. "General Blackwood," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of the moment, "institutional pride is a luxury we can't afford when millions of lives are at stake. The question isn't whether traditional intelligence methods failed. The question is whether we can prevent a catastrophic attack with the time we have remaining." Blackwood turned from the window, his expression showing the internal struggle between institutional loyalty and operational necessity. Elena could see the moment when his training as a military officer overrode his instincts as an institutional politician. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying new determination, "I'll forward your recommendations to the Secretary of Defense. I'll request emergency authorization for defensive measures. And I'll recommend that your analysis be incorporated into immediate threat assessment protocols." Elena felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by the realization that institutional acceptance was only the first step in preventing the attack. They had 28 hours to implement defensive measures against a weapon that most people still didn't believe existed, coordinated by hostile organizations that operated outside traditional intelligence parameters. "General Blackwood," Elena said, "I need to return to my monitoring station. The electromagnetic signature is changing rapidly, and we need real-time analysis to track the deployment timeline." Blackwood nodded, his expression showing the focused intensity of someone who had accepted the reality of an impending crisis. "Dr. Vasquez, you'll have whatever resources you need, whatever support is required to track this threat. And Dr. Vasquez?" Elena paused at the door, turning back to face the general who had dismissed her analysis less than 24 hours earlier. "If your analysis is correct," Blackwood said, "if you prevent this attack, you'll have saved more lives than most military officers save in entire careers. If your analysis is wrong, you'll have caused the largest unnecessary mobilization in American history. Either way, your career in intelligence analysis will never be the same." Elena understood the weight of what Blackwood was telling her. She had moved beyond the realm of institutional protection and conventional career advancement. She was operating in the space where individual judgment could determine the fate of millions, where being right or wrong would have consequences that extended far beyond personal success or failure. "General Blackwood," Elena said, "I understand the stakes. I've understood them from the moment I identified the electromagnetic anomaly. The only choice is between action and paralysis, between prevention and catastrophe." Elena returned to her office to find that it had been transformed into an operational command center. Additional monitoring equipment had been installed, communication lines had been established with multiple intelligence agencies, and technical specialists were analyzing the electromagnetic data in real time. Her analysis had moved from academic exercise to operational intelligence, from individual assessment to institutional priority. Agent Chun was coordinating the expanded monitoring effort, her calm professionalism providing stability in the face of accelerating crisis. "Dr. Vasquez," she said as Elena entered, "the electromagnetic signature has shifted again. The orbital adjustment suggests deployment is now 24 hours out, not 28. Elena felt the weight of time pressing down on her like a physical force. Every hour of delay in institutional acceptance had cost them preparation time. Every moment of bureaucratic resistance had brought them closer to catastrophe. The validation of her analysis was satisfying on a professional level, but the accelerating timeline made such satisfaction seem trivial in the face of what was approaching. "Agent Chun," Elena said, moving to her workstation where the latest electromagnetic data was streaming across multiple monitors. "What defensive measures are being implemented?" The Secretary of Defense has authorized emergency protocols for hardening critical government facilities, Chun replied. FEMA is preparing electromagnetic interference countermeasures for essential infrastructure. The National Guard is being positioned to respond to coordinated attacks on communication networks. Elena studied the data flowing across her screens. Seeing in the electromagnetic patterns the approaching culmination of months of planning by hostile organizations that had identified vulnerabilities in American defensive systems. Her analysis had been correct, but correctness was only valuable if it led to effective countermeasures. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Chun said, "There's something else. The communication intercepts show increased coordination in the past 6 hours. The hostile organizations are accelerating their preparation timeline to match the orbital deployment. They know we're aware of the threat." Elena realized that the leak of information about her analysis had not just validated her conclusions, but had also triggered countermeasures by the hostile organizations. They were racing against American defensive preparations, trying to launch their attack before countermeasures could be fully implemented. The electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon making final adjustments for deployment. The communication intercepts revealed coordination between multiple hostile organizations. The timeline was accelerating beyond her original calculations, driven by the interaction between American awareness and hostile urgency. Elena had been right about the threat, but being right was only the beginning of preventing catastrophe. She had 24 hours to help coordinate defensive measures against an attack that most people still found impossible to believe. 24 hours to prove that her analysis was not paranoid speculation, but accurate assessment of a genuine threat to national security. The electromagnetic data continued to stream across her monitors, each reading a confirmation that time was running out for defensive measures to be implemented. Elena had moved from institutional dismissal to institutional acceptance, but acceptance brought with it the crushing responsibility of being right about a threat that could reshape American society. She returned to her analysis, diving deeper into the electromagnetic patterns, searching for any indication that might help improve defensive measures or provide additional warning time. The data was unforgiving in its mathematical precision, showing exactly when and how the attack would unfold, providing a countdown to catastrophe that no amount of institutional skepticism could dismiss. Elena had been right about the orbital weapon, right about the electromagnetic pulse, right about the coordinated attack strategy. The question now was whether being right would be enough to prevent the catastrophe she had identified with such devastating accuracy. The Pentagon's Emergency Operations Center buzzed with controlled chaos as Elena's electromagnetic readings painted an increasingly urgent picture across wall-mounted displays. 7 hours remained until her calculations indicated the orbital weapon would reach optimal deployment altitude, and every government facility in Washington, D.C. was implementing electromagnetic hardening protocols that had never been tested under actual attack conditions. Elena stood at the center of the crisis coordination, her civilian clothes a stark contrast to the military uniform surrounding her. But her voice now carried the authority of someone whose analysis had transformed from dismissed speculation to operational reality. Secretary of Defense Patricia Reynolds had arrived 30 minutes earlier, her presence transforming the emergency response from departmental coordination to national security priority. At 62, Reynolds possessed the kind of analytical mind that had navigated congressional budget battles and international crisis with equal skill, and her questions about Elena's analysis demonstrated the technical sophistication that had made her one of the most respected defense officials in recent memory. "Dr. Vasquez," Reynolds said, studying the electromagnetic data that continued to stream across multiple monitors, "your analysis indicates the weapon will target the DC electrical grid specifically. What's the projected range of electromagnetic interference?" Elena manipulated the display to show the calculated impact zone, her fingers moving across the touchscreen, with the confidence of someone who had lived with this data for weeks. Madam Secretary, the electromagnetic pulse will affect approximately 200 square miles, covering all major government facilities, most commercial infrastructure, and residential areas within the Beltway. Electronic systems without proper shielding will be permanently damaged. The scope of potential destruction was staggering in its precision. The hostile organizations had calculated exactly how to maximize governmental disruption while minimizing their own exposure to retaliation. Elena's analysis showed that the attack was designed not just to cause damage, but to create specific patterns of chaos that would amplify subsequent conventional strikes. The attack sequence is beginning. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as the theoretical threat she had analyzed for weeks began to materialize into operational reality. The electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon reaching final deployment altitude, while communication intercepts revealed ground teams moving into position for coordinated strikes. "Madam Secretary," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had become the primary expert on an unprecedented threat, "I recommend implementing full emergency protocols immediately. The attack will begin within the next 4 hours. Reynolds nodded, her movement triggering a cascade of orders that transformed the emergency response from preparation to active defense. Elena watched as her analysis became the foundation for decisions that would affect every aspect of American government operations. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of coordination and implementation as Elena's electromagnetic readings provided real-time intelligence on the approaching weapon. Government facilities completed their hardening procedures. Essential personnel were evacuated to secure locations, and backup communication systems were activated in preparation for the electromagnetic disruption. Elena remained at her monitoring station, tracking the orbital weapon's final approach while coordinating with technical specialists who were implementing countermeasures based on her analysis. Her role had evolved from analyst to operational coordinator, from individual expertise to institutional authority. "Dr. Vasquez," Admiral Chun said, approaching her workstation with the expression of someone who had accepted the reality of his earlier mistake, "I owe you an apology. Your analysis was correct from the beginning. I allowed institutional skepticism to override technical evidence." Elena looked up from her monitors, seeing in Chun's expression the weight of institutional failure that she had been fighting against for days. "Admiral Chun, institutional skepticism serves an important purpose. The challenge is knowing when conventional thinking fails to address unconventional threats." "Dr. Vasquez," Chen said, "if this attack had succeeded without warning, if your analysis hadn't been validated by alternative channels, the casualties would have been catastrophic. Your persistence saved lives that will never know they were in danger." Elena realized that Chun's acknowledgement represented more than personal apology. It was recognition that traditional intelligence methods had fundamental limitations that required institutional adaptation. Her success in identifying the threat was valuable not just for preventing this specific attack, but for demonstrating the need for analytical approaches that operated outside conventional parameters. "Admiral Chun," Elena said, "the important thing is that defensive measures are being implemented. The attack will still cause significant disruption, but it won't achieve the catastrophic impact the attackers planned." Elena's electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon reaching optimal deployment altitude, its position confirming the mathematical precision of her original calculations. The weeks of analysis, the institutional resistance, the alternative validation, and the emergency response had all led to this moment when theoretical threat became operational reality. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Chun called from the communication station, "we're detecting final transmission sequences from the orbital weapon. Deployment will begin in approximately 90 minutes. Elena felt the weight of anticipation and dread as the threat she had identified with such analytical precision approached its culmination. Her role had evolved from identifying the danger to helping coordinate the response, from individual analysis to institutional leadership. Secretary Reynolds approached Elena's workstation, her presence bringing the authority of final decision-making to the technical coordination that had consumed the past several hours. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, "your analysis has been extraordinary. The defensive measures you recommended are being implemented across the government. The question now is whether we've done enough." Elena studied the tactical displays that showed the convergence of offensive threat and defensive preparation, her analysis revealing the narrow margin between catastrophic success and manageable disruption. "Madam Secretary, the electromagnetic pulse will cause significant damage, but the hardening measures will preserve critical capabilities. The real test will be our response to the coordinated ground attacks that follow." The electromagnetic weapon was only the first phase of an attack designed to create cascading failures across multiple systems simultaneously. Elena's analysis had identified the orbital threat, but the full scope of the danger extended beyond any single weapon or methodology. "Dr. Vasquez," General Blackwood said, joining the group around her workstation, "the ground forces are positioned to respond to coordinated attacks. Your timeline analysis has allowed us to prepare countermeasures that wouldn't have been possible without advance warning." Elena realized that Blackwood's acknowledgement represented institutional acceptance not just of her specific analysis, but of the analytical approaches that had made her conclusions possible. Her success in identifying the threat was creating space for unconventional thinking within traditionally conservative institutions. "General Blackwood," Elena said, "the coordination pattern suggests the attackers will target communication infrastructure first, then transportation networks, then government facilities. The sequence is designed to prevent coordinated response to subsequent attacks." Elena's analysis of the attack sequence provided tactical intelligence that allowed defensive forces to position themselves optimally for the approaching coordinated strikes. Her role had expanded from threat identification to operational planning, from analytical support to strategic consultation. The electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon beginning its final deployment sequence, the mathematical precision of its approach confirming every calculation Elena had performed over the previous weeks. The theoretical had become operational, the analytical had become tactical, and the dismissed had become validated through the harsh judgment of reality. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Chun announced, "we're detecting weapon activation sequences. The attack sequence is beginning." Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as the theoretical threat she had analyzed for weeks began to materialize into operational reality. The electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon reaching final deployment altitude, while communication intercepts revealed ground teams moving into position for coordinated strikes. "Madam Secretary," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had become the primary expert on an unprecedented threat, "I recommend implementing full emergency protocols immediately. The attack will begin within the next 4 hours." Reynolds nodded, her movement triggering a cascade of orders that transformed the emergency response from preparation to active defense. Elena watched as her analysis became the foundation for decisions that would affect every aspect of American government operations. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of coordination and implementation as Elena's electromagnetic readings provided real-time intelligence on the approaching weapon. Government facilities completed their hardening procedures. Essential personnel were evacuated to secure locations, and backup communication systems were activated in preparation for the electromagnetic disruption. Elena remained at her monitoring station, tracking the orbital weapon's final approach while coordinating with technical specialists who were implementing countermeasures based on her analysis. Her role had evolved from analyst to operational coordinator, from individual expertise to institutional authority. Dr. Vasquez, Admiral Chun said, approaching her workstation with the expression of someone who had accepted the reality of his earlier mistake. I owe you an apology. Your analysis was correct from the beginning. I allowed institutional skepticism to override technical evidence. Elena looked up from her monitors, seeing in Chun's expression the weight of institutional failure that she had been fighting against for days. Admiral Chun, institutional skepticism serves an important purpose. The challenge is knowing when conventional thinking fails to address unconventional threats. Dr. Vasquez, Chen said, if this attack had succeeded without warning, if your analysis hadn't been validated by alternative channels, the casualties would have been catastrophic. Your persistence saved lives that will never know they were in danger. Elena realized that Chun's acknowledgement represented more than personal apology. It was recognition that traditional intelligence methods had fundamental limitations that required institutional adaptation. Her success in identifying the threat was valuable not just for preventing this specific attack, but for demonstrating the need for analytical approaches that operated outside conventional parameters. Admiral Chun, Elena said, the important thing is that defensive measures are being implemented. The attack will still cause significant disruption, but it won't achieve the catastrophic impact the attackers planned. Elena's electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon reaching optimal deployment altitude, its position confirming the mathematical precision of her original calculations. The weeks of analysis, the institutional resistance, the alternative validation, and the emergency response had all led to this moment, when theoretical threat became operational reality. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Chun called from the communication station. We're detecting final transmission sequences from the orbital weapon. Deployment will begin in approximately 90 minutes. Elena felt the weight of anticipation and dread as the threat she had identified with such analytical precision approached its culmination. Her role had evolved from identifying the danger to helping coordinate the response, from individual analysis to institutional leadership. Secretary Reynolds approached Elena's workstation, her presence bringing the authority of final decision-making to the technical coordination that had consumed the past several hours. Dr. Vasquez, she said, your analysis has been extraordinary. The defensive measures you recommended are being implemented across the government. The question now is whether we've done enough. Elena studied the tactical displays that showed the convergence of offensive threat and defensive preparation, her analysis revealing the narrow margin between catastrophic success and manageable disruption. Madam Secretary, the electromagnetic pulse will cause significant damage, but the hardening measures will preserve critical capabilities. The real test will be our response to the coordinated ground attacks that follow. The electromagnetic weapon was only the first phase of an attack designed to create cascading failures across multiple systems simultaneously. Elena's analysis had identified the orbital threat, but the full scope of the danger extended beyond any single weapon or methodology. Dr. Vasquez, General Blackwood said, joining the group around her workstation, the ground forces are positioned to respond to coordinated attacks. Your timeline analysis has allowed us to prepare countermeasures that wouldn't have been possible without advance warning. Elena realized that Blackwood's acknowledgement represented institutional acceptance, not just of her specific analysis, but of the analytical approaches that had made her conclusions possible. Her success in identifying the threat was creating space for unconventional thinking within traditionally conservative institutions. General Blackwood, Elena said, the coordination pattern suggests the attackers will target communication infrastructure first, then transportation networks, then government facilities. The sequence is designed to prevent coordinated response to subsequent attacks. Elena's analysis of the attack sequence provided tactical intelligence that allowed defensive forces to position themselves optimally for the approach in coordinated strikes. Her role had expanded from threat identification to operational planning, from analytical support to strategic consultation. The electromagnetic readings showed the orbital weapon beginning its final deployment sequence, the mathematical precision of its approach confirming every calculation Elena had performed over the previous weeks. The theoretical had become operational, the analytical had become tactical, and the dismissed had become validated through the harsh judgment of reality. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Chun announced, "We're detecting weapon activation sequences. Electromagnetic pulse deployment will begin in 37 minutes. Elena felt the culmination of weeks of analysis approaching with inexorable precision. Her calculations had been correct about the timing, the targeting, the coordination, and the defensive requirements. The question now was whether institutional acceptance had come soon enough to implement effective countermeasures. The electromagnetic pulse struck Washington, D.C. at exactly the time Elena's calculations had predicted, creating a wave of electromagnetic interference that washed across the metropolitan area with surgical precision. Government facilities that had been hardened according to her recommendations maintained critical operations, while unprotected infrastructure experienced the cascading failures she had analyzed in such meticulous detail. Elena watched the attack unfold through her monitoring equipment, seeing her theoretical analysis transform into operational reality as electromagnetic energy disrupted electronic systems across the capital region. The defensive measures she had recommended were working, preserving essential government capabilities while allowing non-critical systems to fail in manageable patterns. "Dr. Vasquez," Secretary Reynolds said, her voice carrying relief and gratitude, "as initial damage reports confirmed the effectiveness of the hardening measures, your analysis was extraordinarily accurate. The electromagnetic pulse achieved precisely the effects you calculated, but the defensive measures have preserved critical infrastructure." Elena felt validation and exhaustion in equal measure, as the attack she had predicted unfolded exactly as her analysis had suggested. The weeks of institutional resistance, the alternative validation, and the emergency implementation had culminated in defensive success that prevented catastrophic governmental collapse. "Madam Secretary," Elena replied, monitoring the electromagnetic readings that showed the orbital weapon completing its deployment sequence. "The coordinated ground attacks will begin in approximately 15 minutes. The electromagnetic disruption was designed to create optimal conditions for conventional strikes. The electromagnetic pulse had been only the first phase of a coordinated attack that Elena's analysis had identified as far more sophisticated than traditional threat assessment methods could recognize. Her role in preventing catastrophic damage was only beginning as the full scope of the assault materialized. The ground attacks began exactly 18 minutes after the electromagnetic pulse, targeting communication infrastructure, transportation, networks, and government facilities with the precision that Elena's analysis had predicted. Defensive forces positioned according to her tactical assessment engaged hostile teams across multiple locations simultaneously, preventing the coordinated strikes from achieving their intended amplification of electromagnetic disruption. Elena coordinated tactical intelligence as the attacks unfolded, her analysis providing real-time assessment of hostile capabilities and defensive effectiveness. Her role had evolved from threat identification to operational leadership, from analytical support to strategic coordination. Dr. Vasquez, Admiral Chun reported from the Tactical Coordination Station. "Defensive forces have neutralized hostile teams at 7 locations. The coordinated attacks are failing to achieve amplification effects. Your analysis allowed us to position countermeasures that prevented catastrophic escalation." Elena realized that her success in identifying the threat had created the conditions for institutional learning that extended beyond this specific crisis. The validation of unconventional analytical methods was changing how intelligence organizations approached threats that operated outside traditional parameters. "Admiral Chun," Elena said, "the hostile organizations will likely attempt secondary attacks when they realize the primary assault has failed. We need to maintain defensive postures for at least 72 hours. Elena's understanding of the attack methodology suggested that the hostile organizations had prepared contingency operations that would be triggered by the failure of their primary assault. Her analysis had prevented catastrophic success, but it hadn't eliminated the ongoing threat from adaptive adversaries. The crisis continued for 18 hours as Elena's analysis guided defensive operations against secondary attacks and infrastructure restoration efforts. Her electromagnetic readings provided intelligence on continued hostile activities, while her tactical assessments helped coordinate response operations across multiple agencies simultaneously. Elena's role during the extended crisis demonstrated how unconventional analytical methods could provide operational value that exceeded traditional intelligence capabilities. Her success in identifying and characterizing the threat had created institutional credibility that transformed how decision-makers approached complex security challenges. Secretary Reynolds concluded the emergency operations by announcing that Elena's analysis had prevented what intelligence assessments suggested would have been the most devastating attack on American government infrastructure in the nation's history. The electromagnetic pulse and coordinated ground strikes had been designed to collapse governmental capabilities entirely, creating conditions for additional attacks that could have reshaped American society. "Dr. Vasquez," Reynolds said during the final briefing, "your analytical work identified a threat that traditional intelligence methods had failed to recognize. Your persistence in pursuing validation through alternative channels prevented institutional blindness from creating catastrophic vulnerability. Your recommendations for defensive measures preserved critical capabilities that allowed us to respond effectively to coordinated attacks." Elena realized that Reynolds' acknowledgement represented institutional transformation that extended beyond personal recognition to fundamental changes in how intelligence organizations approached unconventional threats. Her success had created precedents for analytical methods that operated outside traditional parameters. "Madam Secretary," Elena replied, "the threat was real and imminent. The analytical methods that identified it need to be institutionalized to prevent similar failures in threat recognition. Unconventional attacks require unconventional analysis." Elena's experience with institutional resistance and alternative validation had demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional intelligence methods. Her success in preventing catastrophic attack was creating opportunities for analytical approaches that could address threats operating outside conventional parameters. The aftermath of the crisis brought Elena recognition that transformed her role within the intelligence community from peripheral analyst to central authority on unconventional threat assessment. Her methods were studied, her approaches were institutionalized, and her success became a case study in how individual analytical excellence could overcome institutional limitations. Elena received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony that celebrated not just her specific success in preventing catastrophic attack, but her demonstration of how democratic institutions could adapt to address threats that challenged conventional thinking. Her analysis had saved millions of lives while creating institutional learning that would protect future generations from similar threats. General Blackwood's acknowledgement of Elena's success included recognition that his initial dismissal of her analysis had nearly created catastrophic institutional failure. His acceptance of alternative analytical methods became part of institutional reforms that created space for unconventional thinking within traditionally conservative organizations. "Dr. Vasquez," Blackwood said during the post-crisis evaluation, "your persistence in pursuing validation, despite institutional resistance, demonstrated the kind of analytical courage that democratic institutions require to address evolving threats. Your success has changed how we approach threat assessment. Elena realized that Blackwood's acknowledgement represented institutional maturation that was essential for addressing threats that operated outside traditional parameters. Her success had created precedents for analytical independence that could prevent future failures in threat recognition. Admiral Chun's recognition of Elena's analytical excellence included institutional changes that created formal channels for unconventional threat assessment. Her success in identifying and characterizing the electromagnetic pulse attack became the foundation for intelligence reforms that addressed the limitations of traditional analytical methods. Dr. Vasquez, Chun said, your analytical work has changed how naval intelligence approaches threats that operate outside conventional parameters. Your methods are being incorporated into our standard threat assessment protocols. Elena understood that Chun's institutional changes represented the kind of learning that was essential for preventing similar failures in threat recognition. Her success had created opportunities for analytical approaches that could address evolving security challenges. Elena's personal cost for her analytical success included recognition that her role within the intelligence community had transformed from technical specialist to institutional leader. Her methods were being studied and replicated, her approaches were being institutionalized, and her success was creating expectations for continued excellence in unconventional threat assessment. The electromagnetic pulse attack had been prevented, the coordinated ground strikes had been neutralized, and the hostile organizations had been defeated through defensive measures that Elena's analysis had made possible. Her persistence in pursuing validation despite institutional resistance had prevented catastrophic governmental collapse while creating institutional learning that would protect future generations. Elena returned to her monitoring station in the Pentagon's analytical division, her workspace now equipped with resources that reflected her enhanced role within the intelligence community. Her success in preventing catastrophic attack had created institutional credibility that transformed how decision-makers approached complex security challenges. The electromagnetic readings from her monitoring equipment no longer showed the threatening patterns that had consumed her attention for weeks. The orbital weapon had been neutralized, the hostile organizations had been defeated, and the threat that had seemed so urgent and immediate had been reduced to historical record through defensive measures that her analysis had made possible. Elena's phone rang with a call from her sister Maria, a teacher in Denver who had no idea that Elena's work had prevented an attack that could have collapsed American government operations. The conversation was routine and comfortable, covering family news and weekend plans with the kind of normalcy that Elena had almost forgotten was possible. "Elena," Maria said, "you sound tired. Are you working too hard again?" Elena looked around her office, seeing the monitoring equipment that had tracked an orbital weapon, the communication devices that had coordinated defensive measures, and the analytical tools that had identified a threat operating outside conventional parameters. Her work had prevented catastrophic attack, but her family would never know how close they had come to experiencing societal collapse. "Maria," Elena replied, "work has been intense lately, but things are settling down now." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, providing Elena with the kind of human connection that reminded her why preventing catastrophic attacks was important beyond professional success or institutional recognition. Her analytical work protected the normal life that her sister represented, the routine conversations and family relationships that gave meaning to national security. Elena ended the call and returned to her monitoring duties, scanning electromagnetic frequencies for anomalous patterns that might indicate emerging threats. Her success in preventing the orbital weapon attack had created institutional expectations for continued excellence in unconventional threat assessment. The analytical methods that had identified the electromagnetic pulse threat were being incorporated, into standard intelligence protocols, creating institutional capabilities for addressing threats that operated outside traditional parameters. Elena's success had demonstrated how individual analytical excellence could overcome institutional limitations while creating lasting improvements in national security capabilities. Elena's role within the intelligence community had evolved from technical specialist to institutional authority, from individual analyst to organizational leader. Her success in preventing catastrophic attack had created credibility that extended beyond her specific expertise to broader questions of analytical methodology and institutional adaptation. The electromagnetic pulse attack had been prevented through analytical work that challenged institutional assumptions while demonstrating the value of persistence in pursuing unconventional conclusions. Elena's success had created precedents for analytical independence that could prevent future failures in threat recognition. Elena began preparing her comprehensive analysis of the electromagnetic pulse threat for circulation within the intelligence community, documenting not just the technical aspects of the weapon, but the institutional factors that had nearly prevented its identification. Her report would serve as a case study in how democratic institutions could adapt to address evolving security challenges. The analysis Elena prepared included recommendations for institutional reforms that would create formal channels for unconventional threat assessment, ensuring that future analysts would have the support necessary to pursue conclusions that challenged traditional thinking. Her success had created opportunities for systemic improvements in national security capabilities. Elena's work on electromagnetic pulse threats had demonstrated how sophisticated adversaries could exploit institutional limitations to create vulnerabilities that traditional intelligence methods couldn't recognize. Her success in identifying and preventing the attack had created learning opportunities that would strengthen American defensive capabilities for generations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.